New Year's Eve, 2006. The Bronx streets pulsed with celebration, millions counting down to midnight, dreaming of fresh starts and new beginnings. But for professional boxer Kamal Kolenovic, the final moments of that year would be his last. As others raised their glasses in celebration, a single act of violence would transform an SUV into a weapon and turn a night of joy into one of unthinkable tragedy. The killer melted into the darkness as fireworks blazed overhead, leaving behind a grieving family, a shattered community, and a case that would haunt investigators for nearly 2 decades. For 18 years, he lived free, building a new life while Kolenovic's loved ones were left with only memories and unanswered questions. It was the kind of case that kept detectives awake at night, the kind that made people wonder if some criminals really do escape justice. But December 2024 changed everything in a stunning development that spanned continents. The man who thought he'd outrun his past found himself in handcuffs, finally forced to face the consequences of that fatal New Year's Eve. This is the story of a promising boxer, a calculated killer, and an 18-year manhunt that would test the limits of justice itself. But before we dive deeper into the mystery, I'd like to ask you a small favor. The statistics show that more than 70% of you watching aren't subscribed to the channel yet. If you're enjoying these deep dives into true crime and want to stay updated on future cases, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow and ensure you don't miss out on any new videos. The American dream often begins with a leap of faith. For Kamal Kolenovic, that leap came in 1993, when he left his homeland of Montenegro at just 14 years old. Like countless immigrants before him, he arrived in New York City with little more than hope and determination. But in his case, those would prove to be powerful weapons in the ring and in life. Landing in Brooklyn, young Kamal quickly learned the meaning of hustle. His days were split between construction sites and restaurant kitchens, his calloused hands testament to the immigrant's grind. But it was in the evenings, within the weathered walls of Gleason's gym, where Kamal truly came alive. Under the fluorescent lights of this Brooklyn boxing institution, he found his calling. The legendary Gleason's gym had seen its share of champions walk through its doors, but there was something special about Kamal. His coach, Chelo Betancourt, noticed it immediately. Not just the raw talent, but the hunger in his eyes. He wasn't just fighting for himself, Betancourt would later recall. He was fighting for every immigrant kid who ever dreamed of making it. Between 1999 and 2006, Kamal carved out a respectable professional career. His record, 10 wins, 6 losses, and 2 draws, might not scream superstar, but anyone who watched him fight saw a warrior's heart. In 2003, his dedication paid off when he clinched the New York State welterweight title, a moment that validated years of sacrifice and cemented his place in the boxing community. But it wasn't just his performances in the ring that earned Kamal respect. In a sport often marked by bravado and trash talk, he stood out for his humility. Fellow boxers at Gleason's remembered how he'd always make time for young fighters, sharing techniques and stories from his journey. Even as his reputation grew, he never forgot his roots, remaining a fixture in his community and a source of pride for both his adopted home and his Montenegrin heritage. Life wasn't always kind to Kamal. The boxing world can be brutal, and staying competitive meant endless hours of training while juggling jobs to make ends meet. Yet, those who knew him never heard him complain. He faced each challenge with the same quiet determination that had carried him from Montenegro to the bright lights of New York rings. By 2006, at 27 years old, Kamal was hitting his stride. His boxing career was stable, his community ties were strong, and his future seemed bright. He had become living proof that the American dream was still possible. A local kid who'd fought his way up from nothing. But sometimes fate has other plans, and on New Year's Eve, 2006, Kamal Kolenovic would face an opponent he never saw coming. December 31st, 2006, the Moonlight restaurant and bar in the Bronx was alive with New Year's energy. The venue, a popular spot among locals, was packed with people ready to bid farewell to 2006. Kamal Kolenovic was there too, not as a boxer or a local celebrity, but simply as another patron looking forward to celebrating with friends. The night had started normally enough. The music was loud, drinks were flowing, and the mood was festive. Security cameras would later capture Kamal moving through the crowd, exchanging greetings with familiar faces. He wasn't involved in any trouble. Those who knew him said that wasn't his style, but trouble was brewing elsewhere in the bar. As midnight approached, voices began to rise near the bar area. What started as heated words between patrons quickly escalated into something more volatile. Among those involved was Amit Ghashi, a man whose name would soon be etched into the darker pages of Bronx history. The argument, witnesses would later recall, seemed to spiral out of control with frightening speed. Kamal, like many others in the bar, found himself drawn to the commotion. As a former boxer, he was no stranger to confrontation, but friends say he was always more peacemaker than provocateur. As the dispute spilled onto the sidewalk outside the Moonlight, Kamal followed. Perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps hoping to help calm things down. It would prove to be a fatal decision. The winter air was crisp, the sidewalk crowded with onlookers and those involved in the dispute. What happened next unfolded with horrifying speed. Ghashi, his face contorted with rage, stormed toward his SUV parked nearby. In that moment, no one could have predicted the devastating choice he was about to make. Witnesses described the sound of an engine roaring to life, tires screeching against pavement. Then came the screams. Ghashi had turned his vehicle into a weapon, deliberately mounting the curb and aiming straight for the crowd. The SUV plowed forward with terrifying purpose, sending people scrambling for safety, but Kamal couldn't get out of the way in time. The impact was devastating. The force of the collision threw Kamal against a tree, the sound of the crash mixing with the horrified gasps of onlookers. In an instant, a promising life was snuffed out on a sidewalk that should have been hosting New Year's celebrations. As Kamal lay motionless, Ghashi fled the scene, leaving chaos and tragedy in his wake. Emergency services arrived quickly, their sirens cutting through the night air, but it was already too late. Kamal Kolenovic, the boxer who had fought his way up from nothing, who had embodied the American dream, was pronounced dead. The time of death would be recorded as just minutes before the new year, a cruel twist that would forever mark what should have been a time of celebration. In the immediate aftermath, the scene outside the Moonlight descended into pandemonium. Friends and witnesses struggled to process what they had just seen. Some tried desperately to help Kamal. Others attempted to note down the SUV's license plate. But in the chaos of the moment, Ghashi had already made his escape. As the first minutes of 2007 ticked by, police began the grim task of cordoning off the area and collecting witness statements, knowing they were now dealing with a homicide that would shake the Bronx community to its core. While the Bronx was still reeling from Kamal's death, Amit Ghashi was already putting his escape plan into action. The killer's SUV, last seen speeding away from the Moonlight restaurant and bar, would never be found. Within hours of the murder, Ghashi had vanished, seemingly into thin air, but his disappearance was anything but improvised. Investigators would later piece together that Ghashi had moved with calculated precision. While police were still processing the crime scene, he was already executing what appeared to be a well-thought-out escape route. He'd abandoned his vehicle, gathered essential documents, and begun his journey out of New York City. The speed of his departure suggested he'd been prepared for such a scenario, or at least knew exactly how to disappear. The NYPD's initial investigation hit immediate roadblocks. Though witnesses had clearly identified Ghashi as the driver, and surveillance footage confirmed their accounts, catching a killer who who'd already fled the country, presented a unique set of challenges. By the time authorities had issued an arrest warrant, Gashi had already made his way to the Balkans, a region he knew well and where he had deep-rooted connections. The Balkans proved to be the perfect hiding spot. With its complex web of borders, varying legal systems, and tight-knit communities, the region had long been a favored refuge for those looking to evade justice. Gashi seemed to vanish into this landscape, using local connections and knowledge to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. For NYPD detectives, the case quickly turned into a frustrating game of international cat and mouse. Every promising lead seemed to end in disappointment. Reported sightings would surface periodically. Gashi had been spotted in Montenegro, then Serbia, then elsewhere. But by the time authorities could act on these tips, the trail had gone cold again. The challenges weren't just geographical. Legal hurdles complicated matters further. International arrest warrants had to navigate a maze of diplomatic channels and jurisdictional issues. Even when local authorities in the Balkans cooperated, the bureaucratic red tape often meant delays that gave Gashi time to move on before any action could be taken. Back in the Bronx, investigators refused to let the case go cold. Detective James Byrne, who led the investigation, kept Kamal's photo on his desk, a constant reminder of unfinished business. Some killers think that if they can just get across a border, they're home free, Byrne would later say. But this case was different. We weren't going to let distance or time stand in the way of justice. For almost 2 decades, Gashi played a dangerous game of hide and seek across the Balkans. Like a ghost, he drifted between countries, never staying long enough to cast a shadow. But his freedom came with a price. A life spent looking over his shoulder, wondering when his past would finally catch up to him. Back in the Bronx, Kamal's presence remained strong. His photo at Gleason's gym served as both memorial and motivation, while annual boxing tournaments in his name kept his story alive. Detective Byrne and his team chased down leads that stretched from Montenegro to Serbia, always seeming to arrive just days too late. We knew roughly where he was, one detective admitted. We just couldn't get to him. The rise of social media in advancing technology slowly began to turn the tide. Facial recognition software, international police cooperation, and increasingly sophisticated surveillance methods started shrinking Gashi's world. What was once a vast hiding ground became more like a closing trap. Each passing year brought new tools, new techniques, and new determination to the investigation. By 2020, the landscape of international fugitive hunting had transformed dramatically. As Gashi grew more comfortable in his life on the run, perhaps even complacent, he couldn't see that his time was running out. The breakthrough that would end his 18 years of freedom was just around the corner. December 2024 dawned like any other month in the long manhunt for Amit Gashi. But behind the scenes, international law enforcement was closing in. Years of patient investigation, technological advances, and strengthened diplomatic ties were about to pay off in a way that would stun the Bronx community and bring long-awaited news to Kamal's loved ones. The breakthrough came through a combination of old-fashioned police work and modern surveillance. Serbian authorities, working in close coordination with U.S. law enforcement, had been monitoring specific locations based on intelligence gathered over the previous months. Gashi, who had grown increasingly comfortable in his life as a fugitive, had made the fatal mistake of establishing predictable patterns. On a cold morning in early December, Serbian special forces moved in. The operation was swift and precise, the kind of decisive action that had eluded authorities for nearly 2 decades. Gashi, now in his 50s, was caught completely off guard. The man who had evaded justice for 18 years was finally in handcuffs. His long run from the law ending not with a dramatic chase, but with a quiet arrest in a region he had considered his sanctuary. News of the arrest traveled fast. In the Bronx, Detective Byrne who had kept the case alive through years of dead ends, received the call he'd been waiting for since that fatal New Year's Eve. "We got him," was all he needed to hear. The moment was bittersweet, a victory tempered by the knowledge that it had taken 18 years too long. The extradition process, often a lengthy bureaucratic maze, moved with surprising speed. Both U.S. and Serbian authorities, aware of the case's high profile and the long wait for justice, expedited the necessary paperwork. Within days, arrangements were made to bring Gashi back to face the music in New York. His return to the Bronx was deliberately low-key, but heavy with symbolism. The same streets where he had once fled in panic now witnessed his return in custody. Gashi was escorted into central booking, his face showing the weight of years spent looking over his shoulder. The charges awaiting him were clear: second-degree murder, a crime that carried a sentence of up to life in prison. At the precinct, detectives who had worked the case over the years gathered to witness the moment. Some had retired, others had moved to different departments, but all had been drawn back by the news of Gashi's capture. For them, this wasn't just another arrest. It was the closing of a chapter that had haunted the department for almost 2 decades. The evidence against Gashi, preserved through the years, remained strong. Witness statements, surveillance footage, and physical evidence had been meticulously maintained, waiting for this very moment. The careful documentation of that fatal night was about to serve its purpose, ensuring that the passage of time wouldn't prevent justice from being served. As Gashi stood before the judge, just weeks shy of another New Year's Eve, he bore little resemblance to the man who'd fled 18 years earlier. Gone was the arrogance of a fugitive who thought he'd beaten the system. In its place stood a defeated man facing the consequences he'd spent nearly 2 decades running from. At Gleason's gym, Kamal's photo watches over a new generation of fighters, his story now carrying a different weight. "It's what we've waited for," his former trainer said of Gashi's arrest, "but it doesn't bring him back." The bittersweet victory serves as a reminder that while justice may be slow, it rarely sleeps. What makes someone wait 18 years for justice? For those who kept Kamal's case alive, the detectives who never gave up, the community that never forgot, the answer was simple. Some debts must be paid, no matter how long it takes. If this story tells us anything, it's that running from your past is just another form of prison. Hit subscribe for more true crime stories that prove justice has no expiration date.